So Cathy, before you do that, oh, never mind. We just started recording, and so we're good to go.
Okay. All right. Okay. Gracious Lord, in all our doings with your most gracious favor, extend to us your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally, by your mercy, bring us to everlasting life through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Amen.
I'd like to welcome all of you, and please share questions as you have them in the chat, and we'll try and deal with those. We'll have an opportunity for breakout sessions and share some best practices. See, the guidelines Phil had shared in emails and and it's on the Synod website, the guidance for remote meetings. Do you want to add some comments to that, Phil?
Sure. And so essentially, there's there's a number of different ways that you can move forward. We've had congregations move forward with fully remote meetings. We've had congregations move forward with some sort of hybrid meeting. So some people in the church building and some people joining in by Zoom or conference call. What needs kind of the constitutionality of that really of being able to have people join in by remote means is dependent upon the state that you're incorporated in. So for congregations in Washington, it's different than congregations in Idaho. Washington and Oregon are very similar as far as the allowance of remote people joining remotely. And that's as long as your congregation constitution or your organization's constitution and bylaws does not forbid it, you're good to go. For those of you in Idaho and Wyoming, some additional action does need to be taken. Well, if your constitution is silent on whether or not to allow people to join in by remote means, then additional action is needed for those congregations in Idaho and Wyoming, because the Idaho and Wyoming state code doesn't outright allow people to join by remote means. So since the state code is silent, that means that, and essentially what the state code says is that if your bylaws don't say anything about where you're meeting and how your meeting is to be conducted, then it needs to take place at your primary office. So essentially it has to take place at the church building. And so those are the two things that you really need to look at as far as, especially the Idaho congregations need to look at their constitution. And if the constitution doesn't say that that remote meetings are okay by the congregation, then some additional action needs to be made. In all states, the boards can take action by remote means, and so that means your councils or your board can meet via Zoom or conference call. In all states, for remote meetings, the basic thing that needs to be met is that everybody in the meeting needs to be able to hear everyone else and be heard by everyone else. So the fancy language for that is simultaneous oral communication. So you don't need Zoom. A conference call is totally sufficient. So by conference call or speakerphone, so you don't need to see everyone, but you do need to you do need to be able to hear everyone and be heard by everyone. So that's kind of the basic outlines. As Cathy mentioned in the intro, in any congregational meeting or any meeting, one thing that's important is documenting who's actually present. And that gets a little, that takes a little bit more time and effort when you're meeting remotely. It's not impossible, but it is a crucial thing to pay attention to, is how are you going to make sure you can document attendance. For Zoom, it's not good enough just to have who's the devices that are on, because in this case, both Greg and Carol would be present in this meeting, even though we cannot see Greg, and even though they're on the same device. And so you need to keep that in mind, that you can't just say, oh, look, we have 26 people on the, or 26 devices or participants per Zoom. We actually have more people on this meeting than the 26. So
Pastor, I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't recall ever taking a roll call at an in-person annual meeting, but instead to simply affirm that there is a quorum. So you're asking for something different here. Is the reason for contact tracing, or is it to ensure you've established a quorum?
Yeah, it's for quorum purposes.
Okay.
So the
requirement is that you have a legitimate quorum.
Right. Yep.
Period.
Yep.
Right?
And one of the reasons why it's more important, so let me back up. A best practice for in-person congregational meetings is actually you don't need to do a roll call, but a really good practice is to have a printout of all the voting members, and then have people sign in as they join the meeting, right? And so there, it's super simple, and there you have documentation more than just in the minutes of who was actually present. And it also helps you keep your voting membership list updated year to year. You know, that you go through that list, or someone from the congregation a couple people from the congregation go through that list annually, and have people sign in. So that's a good practice to get in the habit of for in-person meetings. And it takes pretty much zero time, because people just sign next to their name as they come into the meeting. And so, but one of the reasons why it's important to document that a little bit further for remote meeting is that only people present can vote. And so depending on how you do that's the other thing that you need to be thinking about when you're having people participate remotely, is how are you going to how are you going to have them vote? Most congregational action, and especially during the general annual meetings, it's done by a simple voice vote. And so that can, Kirsten, I see your hand, and so I'll wrap this up and come to you. So that can certainly be done with the oral communication, is by voice vote. But some congregations have in their constitutions and bylaws that budgets need to be passed by a written ballot, and all call process votes. So all votes to extend a call to a pastor or a deacon needs to be done by written ballot. And so there, you need to make sure you have a written. We can get to how you would do a written ballot with a remote meeting. But there you really need to have written documentation of who was actually present in the meeting, so that when those ballots arrive at the church, either by mail or drop off, that you can confirm that only the people that were present are actually the ones that are being counted for votes. So that's the other reason why it's a little bit more important with remote meetings to have a clear documentation is when you get to the voting process. Kirsten, what's your question?
My question was just clarifying the roll call piece. I like the idea of doing a sign in person. That's something we should have been doing. And maybe we did, I don't know. But for example, so it seems like it would be helpful to do a roll call on Zoom then to say, like your example with Carol, like, hi, Carol, I see you're here. Does that mean anyone else is in the room with you? I mean, so it seems like we do need to go through each person and check and like make sure how many people we have.
Yep. And it can be time consuming. For example, St. Luke's, our largest congregation in our synod, had a call meeting remotely at the beginning of October. They had over 180 participants on that meeting and 325, I think, people in attendance. They literally had to go through each participant one by one and say, who's here? It took 45 minutes just to get attendance, but then the rest of the meeting went really smooth. So it is possible, especially if you have a larger congregation. I would highly recommend that you have a team of people working on that. And one way to make that more efficient is open up the meeting before the meeting officially starts. So they started a half hour before the meeting started, and it still went into the meeting time. But you can do that and the way they did it is make use of the waiting room. We're clear ahead of time that when you sign on, you're going to be sitting in the waiting room for a period of time. And when they let people in one by one, and essentially said, "Who's here?" And so it can be time consuming, but it is really important to get that done.
Excuse me, Phil. Thanks. That's, I think, helpful. I just want to let everyone know that I'm monitoring the chat for questions and watching for raised hands. We'll all kind of watch for that. But so either way, if you know how to enter a question in the chat, you can do that. Put a large Q or a capital Q so we can kind of discern between questions and comments, or you can raise your hand. So the next question comes from Paul Malek. How do you do conference calls with many people on the phone? Can we use the Synod conference call authorization?
Yes, and so we do have a conference call, an account with a conference call company as a Synod, and that is available. We can only have one conference call going at a time, so scheduling is a little bit of an issue, but that's a pretty lightly used resource, and so certainly that's available. Paul, Lake Chelan Lutheran has actually been worshiping using conference call, and so if you get in touch throughout the pandemic, so Paul Palumbo would also have, and they're using a different system that they love. And so I don't know what that system is, but I don't think it's very expensive. But Paul Palumbo would be another resource if you're looking to that. But certainly just get in touch with one of the Synod staff and we can make that conference call resource available to you. It's really easy to use. The leader calls a number and has a leader code. And then everybody else that joins has a different, calls a number. It's a 1-800 number, so it's toll free. And then they enter a participation code, and everybody enters the same. Every participant enters the same code.
The company that we use is called the Conference Group, and it's very simple to use, easy to set up. So if you want it, there's no contract involved. It's as you use it, you're billed for it. And so just signing up is just with a credit card. They will invoice you for each use. And so we have used that for some call committee meetings. Mm-hmm. And as Phil was describing, there's a leader code, same phone number, leader initiates the call, then the participants dial in with a participant code. and it's 0.039 cents per minute per participant. So it's very inexpensive and the quality is really good. You can choose to record the meeting as well.
Mhm.
So,
Can you put, Cathy, can you put in the chat the name of the company or contact,
yes,
a link?
sure.
And then our next question, hand up by Gina. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
So my question is that one of the things our council was talking about is actually doing a mail-in ballot where
Mhm.
we send out our annual meeting or annual report and an official ballot and mail back stuff the beginning of January. And then our official meeting will be on the 24th of January. But the reason we wanted to do that is because there are so many people in our congregation who are not able to, or for some reason don't want to take advantage of Zoom. And I don't know if we'd be able to have a quorum on a Zoom call. So if they mail in their ballots, does that count as a quorum if they have signed their ballot and saying, yes, this is my vote?
No.
Okay.
Because
answer.
absentee voting and proxy voting are not allowable. And the difference between the people, and so only the people that are present at the meeting can you actually count their ballots. But they don't need to be present by Zoom. You can do a couple of different ways to have their present. So people that don't want to use Zoom, if they could be present even on a conference call or by telephone. I've even had people call my cell phone and put my cell phone on speakerphone and set it next to my computer, so the computer microphone picks up their voice and shoots it through the Zoom. That would be okay as well. Again, it's simultaneous oral communication. And so they could certainly mail in their ballots, but you wouldn't be able to officially count them towards a quorum unless they are actually present at the meeting. But mailing out ballots ahead of time, that's a good idea. Just a note on that, I would not have them sign their ballots. The ballots, when you do a written ballot in an in-person meeting, ballots are anonymous.
Right.
Right? And so what you do is you have their names on the envelope, and then have the ballots, the ballots are anonymous. And so the ballots are in an envelope. The names are on the outside of the envelope. So when the envelopes arrive, and you can mail, a lot of our congregations have done drop off. So they just drop them by the church building, or St. Luke's set up a drop off at a different location, an offsite location, and just communicated that and saying, this is where you're going to drop off your ballot. And so people they don't need to mail it in. They can drop it off, and that's a little bit quicker than using the postal service in many of our locations. You need to be clear about what is the deadline for the ballots to arrive. That's another piece that you want to communicate.
If we can't use absentee ballots as being counted anyway, then we're going to have to figure out a different way to do this.
Yeah.
Whether that be postpone our meeting. The only reason we were going to have them sign them was that was their official ballot, and then that would be counted towards the whole on our meeting.
Yeah.
But if that's not allowed, yeah, I don't know. We'll figure something out.
Yep.
We'll have to figure something else out.
So that just kind of speaking to that, what are your options if you can't get a quorum together?
Postponing our meeting until later on in the year, I think, would be our only option.
Postpone, not in Idaho or in Oregon, and I'm still awaiting answers for congregations in Washington. So in Oregon, in Idaho, in your state code, under the Nonprofit Corporation Act, the board, when there's an emergency, when when the state or when your locations under a state of emergency, or in both states, how it's defined is an emergency is defined as an emergency exists for the purposes of this section if a quorum of the corporation's directors or members cannot readily be assembled for some present or imminent catastrophic event. So in all of our states right now, well, I don't know about Wyoming, but in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, the governor's office kind of emergency orders would satisfy that, and that allows your board to take action on behalf of the organization exercising the emergency powers. And so you could pass a budget, for example, as a council and do it by remote means, and that would be allowable. Now, Washington State does not have emergency powers in their Nonprofit Corporation Act. They have it in their For-Profit Corporation Act, but not in their nonprofit one. And so I'm awaiting word from our Senate attorney on what's the deal with Washington, because I don't know. So for those congregations that aren't in Washington, you can you can in your council or your board, you can pass, you can essentially pass a motion saying that we're going to exercise our emergency powers. Now in all of our states, if you do not have an annual meeting, it is in our Nonprofit Corporation Acts that doesn't mean that your organization it doesn't mean your organization's dissolved. And so essentially it can continue to function. And essentially those people serving on council would continue to serve on council until they are replaced. And it's unclear about the budget issue, but what I would say is that you'd essentially move forward with the most recent budget that's passed, again, until you can meet and update that. And so just because you can't get a meeting together doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden that your organization's not allowed to function, or
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I've got another meeting I got to jump on, but I appreciate that. That's very helpful, and good luck to the rest of you as well. I look forward to watching the recording later.
Okay, and then we have a question from Dan Harris. Dan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so earlier on, you said there were other things you needed to do in the state of Idaho to address the issue of that, but you didn't cover what they are. And so if you could cover what are the extra things we need to do, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and so if your constitution has, and where you look for congregational meetings is chapter 10 of your constitution. And if your constitution has a provision that allows remote meetings, then no additional action is needed in Idaho. But if you do not have that provision in your constitution, then the next best option is for the council to pass a continuing resolution that says remote meetings are allowable for our congregation. And as soon as I'm done talking, I'll put the language in the chat as far as what that continuing resolution should say. And a continuing resolution, it needs to be passed by a 2/3 majority vote by the council. And then that continuing resolution needs to be communicated to the congregation and also to the Senate office. And that's in the continuing resolution chapter of your constitution, which I believe is chapter 17. And so that's the additional action that needs to be taken, is to pass a continuing resolution that makes allowance for a congregational meeting by remote means. And again, our congregations in Idaho and Wyoming are the ones that need to do that because the Oregon and Washington state codes state explicitly that remote meetings are okay. As long as your constitution doesn't forbid it, you're good to go in those states. Does that get at your question, Dan?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Phil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it looks like we have a question from Carol Yeager. Can council members be voted on by council emergency action similar to passing a budget?
Yes, I would think so. You know, essentially what the emergency, but again, in Washington, I'm unclear. There isn't an emergency powers piece to the Washington State Code. I don't have the, so essentially, what the emergency powers allows you to do well, here, let me, you'll have to, I'll post links to the different, where to find the different state codes. And it's going to be inefficient for me to kind of speak directly to what's allowable and not allowable, because you really do need to pay attention to how the state code is written. But I would say yes. Essentially, you know, you need to be acting in good faith for the sake of the organization. But you know, electing council members would be. But I mean, as far as council members, the other thing that I believe the council has the authority to do is to appoint council members to vacant positions. So you could essentially do that. And then when you appoint somebody to a position, to a term, at the next congregational meeting, that appointment simply needs to be affirmed. If I'm remembering Constitution right, and again, not having, I'd have to sit down, and I'm just kind of speaking off the top of my head. You'd want to reference everything that I say against your congregational constitution to make sure that I'm actually speaking rightly. And so I don't have it. I have a pretty good grasp on them, but I don't have them completely memorized word for word.
Updating constitutions seems to be rather important these days with how things are functioning. We have some congregations that still have the original 1988 Constitution. So is it true the model Constitution that's available is the guiding document, Phil?
I'm not sure enough to say yes or no. I kind of think so, but I don't know that.
We could put together some Q&As and get that published. Check that with our Constitution Committee.
Mm-hmm. So that's the Idaho State Code. Here's the Oregon. I see. I need to title these. Oh, well. And these are direct links to the nonprofit corporation acts in each state.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing any other questions right at the moment. Cathy, I believe you had some additional things that you wanted to share about meetings in general and maybe specific.
Sure. So some of the practical issues are having a Zoom host, and council secretary would obviously take care of recording minutes, having a secondary person to track attendance. And as Phil described, the process for admitting people and tracking that attendance is a really good tip. Having people muted, just some of the basics, protocols for using Zoom, having people muted. If internet is unstable, turning off the camera makes a difference. So just knowing how the agenda is going to go, who's handling which detail. We tend to just, when we're in person, those roles are clear, but when they're handled on a Zoom meeting, knowing who's going to be handling that. And then as you deal with 2 or 3 or 4 screens of people, a process of managing questions and having, a process to deal with that is a key piece. Voting process, Phil described one, how in a large setting, how that worked for St. Luke with a call process. Google Forms is another way to use a voting process. You can prepare a form in advance and email that out. You can have a series of questions. You can have simple questions. But you do have to be able to track, who's voting. And so with each device, the Google form is only going to work so well. So you would have to be prepared with how to vote if you're using that process. So, and Mary commented using earbuds helps as well with background noise. So those are some of the basics of just having that planned out. Let's see, Google. Okay, so Phil is saying the Google form. So if you're calling for a private ballot, Google Forms records the vote. So that probably is not sufficient.
Yeah, and it's also, if your constitution, or in the case of a call vote, it's actually the Senate Constitution that calls for a paper ballot or a written ballot. And it's not clear if Google form or like an online voting system is sufficient for that constitution call for. So, so just be mindful of that. But also, but for other things, you can certainly use an online voting system like a Google form, or even the Zoom has a polling feature. But just that can work, but just be aware that with most of those, there's going to be at least someone who knows how, at least for 1 or 2 people, the votes will not be anonymous when you use most online voting platforms, which again, for most of us, that's probably not a big deal. But I think it would probably be important to be clear about that in your communication, just so you don't surprise anybody with that. One of the things with doing any sort of remote meeting or a congregational meeting in a different way is the better your communication is on the front end, the more clear your communication is about how the meeting is going to be conducted, and process and all of that. That becomes really, really important to just have clear communication. And don't be afraid to have practice meetings ahead of time with your whole congregation. You can there's no need, there's nothing to prevent you from practicing. And certainly you'll want to have, practice at the very least with that. If you assemble a team of people that are going to kind of, that are going to take on different roles during the meeting, you'll want to at least do a walkthrough with your leading team ahead of time, and then get a couple of people who aren't on that team to join in on that practice, just so you can, it'll help you kind of, because there's always things that you don't think of ahead of time. And so you'll want to make sure that you walk through kind of the meeting with that team at the very least. But for congregations that have done remote meetings, having practice meetings ahead of time with Zoom for those members who aren't, or with the conference call who aren't as comfortable with it, has been really helpful to kind of decrease the anxiety and increase comfort level. Zoom even allows you to set up test meetings on kind of a, so if you go to their support place, you can see, and so you can see how that works. And so you don't even have to go through the process of setting up additional meetings, but part of the issue is, or part of the art and science of this is actually setting up the meeting. And so, I think there's value in setting up additional test meetings ahead of time. Or if you're using Zoom, another thing, just because you schedule a meeting for a certain time, you can actually start that meeting at any point. So you can use the same, and you can restart that meeting as many times as you want without even having a recurring meeting. So you can set your meeting up and you can keep that link. You can use that link for your test meetings ahead of time, and then you can use that link for your meeting time. The one caution with that is so when you host a meeting, as a co-host right now, I can remove any of you from this meeting. But if I do that, then you won't be able to get back into this meeting ever. And since this is our recurring weekly check-in, you wouldn't be able to join any of our weekly check-ins in the future. This link essentially goes dead for that device if you kick somebody out of the meeting, which is good for removing people who aren't supposed to be here. But if you, for example, if you remove somebody from one of those test meetings, that means they won't be able to join the real meeting. Or during the meeting, if you remove somebody because their microphone is constantly being disruptive, just know that they're not coming back on. And so be aware of the consequences of that, removing someone from your Zoom meeting.
One way maybe to handle that is to put them in a waiting room if that's an issue. One of the items, we had our congregational meeting a couple weeks ago and did not have a quorum. So we'll be doing it again in January, hopefully with a quorum. But one of the items that we considered doing was to prepare the budget and record a presentation on the budget and send that out in advance, or have it as a YouTube post for congregation members to watch in advance, and hopefully have some greater understanding, develop their questions. We asked our members to email our treasurer and the president and the pastor to have any questions answered. And we were hoping that would keep it efficient. We had some people in the sanctuary, and so that way we were hoping to modify the length of time that would normally be taken. And so that's something to consider in preparing for the meeting, is information out in advance. It's not easy for people to, this format is not the norm, and I'm not sure if the potluck was the big draw for the annual meeting or not. Apparently it was more so. Let's see, other questions. Okay, so Kirsten, your question is examples of what kind of vote needs to be anonymous. Some constitutions, I believe, say ballot or a paper ballot is required for the budget vote. So that, I think, would be I think that's the only example I can think of.
Yeah, I don't think they need to be anonymous. I just think they typically are anonymous. So,
Except not if we're voting in person, because if you're just doing a verbal vote, that's not anonymous because you know what people are saying.
yeah. Yep. Again, and in generally, you know, it's going to depend on your congregation on how hung up folks are on the anonymous thing. But most things that are passed by a verbal vote are those things that, you know, they're they're generally the least contentious of the votes, and so where there'd be the least amount of concern around anonymous stuff. Sometimes when votes get really contentious, that's when people start making motions to call for things like written ballots or anonymous votes, and so that's and it's and again, I'm just re-looking at the Senate or the congregational constitutions, and I, at least in the congregation meeting section for the most recent model, it doesn't say anywhere that votes need to be anonymous, and so that and that's just a quick scan. So I don't think it's a necessary thing. I think it's just a practice thing.
Except what I hear and what you just said was, it is possible, even if we're meeting like this, that somebody could call for
Yep.
an anonymous thing. So we need to be prepared to do that, even if I don't want to, because it sounds like
Yep.
that is going to be extremely hard.
Yep, absolutely. Because again, all of our congregations and organizations, they function under Robert's rules. And under Robert's rules, you know, that is allowable to call for a written ballot to, and this is where we need a parliamentarian. But they can also, because a common, or the most common way that that's called for is when somebody calls for a division of the House. And I need to consult Robert's rules and look up exactly what that means. But I know it, at the very least, it means that you need to have a tally of all the votes for and all the votes against. But I don't know if there's an anonymous portion to that, or if then it's a public, everybody's vote is public. I'd have to look at Robert's rules to figure that out. But usually, you know, when people start calling for divisions of House, that's when, you know, you're thankful for Robert's Rules of Order to kind of keep parameters around things, because that's when it means things are the anxiety in the room is pretty high, and there's at least a couple people that are pretty disgruntled about whatever's going on. Which is a note that, you know, maybe having somebody have just a quick review of Robert's rules wouldn't, you know, that probably should be something that we do regularly anyways. But it's probably not a bad, because that's, again, kind of the three governing documents for our congregations are our congregational constitutions and bylaws, state code, and Robert's Rules of Order are the three things that kind of guide how we function.
All right, we'll take some time to go into breakout groups. Mary has posed some questions in the chat. So we'll have, probably 10 minutes in breakout rooms. And so, let's see, here we go. Let's see. All right, can everybody, you can see the questions. How are you planning to hold your congregation's annual meeting? What platform? All right.
Cathy, do you want Senate staff to join the breakout rooms?
Sure. Yeah. All right. All right. Let's see here. All right. So let's see. Make sure. Okay, so Darcy and Elizabeth. Good morning. So how is it going for planning meetings in your tech context? Okay, Darcy, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Mike. I'm gonna go back on this. I gotta go back on this.
I know, it's like we didn't get our 57 seconds.
I know.
No,
No, we
Zoom,
didn't.
we're back.
That was a fake out. Just,
That's sneaky Kathy.
I'm gonna have to go back on this because it's gonna go off on me again with this many. So I'll go back on video, but I'm here.
Andy, we like you. We like to see you.
Well, I appreciate it because many people come to Jesus when they don't. Fortunately, when I turn up, they all backslide. I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, I'd like seeing you guys too, but until we get this internet stuff cleared up here, it just keeps spreading. I'll leave it on unless it goes off. I'll leave it on for the moment. But I like seeing you all too. It's been so nice watching your. I miss everybody. I miss. Yeah, it was good for BishCon, but I do miss the time socially. Oh, you guys are just, you're important to me, you know, because I know
They're
we all,
important to us too.
but this is great. I just want to say before we start, I just want to say this is great. You have given me a lot, you guys. Phil, you've given me so much stuff. I've been typing notes to send to my council, and I will use the video for the council.
good. And just a note, know that you know, we certainly didn't cover everything and won't cover everything in our time together, but Synod staff are here as a resource for you all as you keep on. So if questions come up as you go forward with, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here for conversation and try to, and we're here to help you all navigate some of these issues. So,
Can I ask a question? And then I'll get off. Has anybody, we just put a scrubber on our air vent system at the church in the sanctuary. And we did it because one of our members is involved with basically heating and ventilation units. And he got us the scrubber and we just had to pay for the installation. But the question I have is, allegedly they're extremely good for this period and this time, but also for flu, but especially right now. And I'm wondering, has anybody got any information as far as the usefulness of this for having to be able to hold an annual meeting in person versus having to go to remote? So I'd be interested in any background or experience or information you have on this that goes beyond what I've got, because that we've thought about this as a possibility, either hybrid or as actually doing it. So we don't have to. We'd probably still do hybrid because we get people in who won't be able to come anyway, they won't come. Mm-hmm. But this would help a lot with having to deal with a quorum, because we could have a quorum, at least in church possibly, with the numbers that we could be allowed. Yeah. I'll wait for your.
I don't know of any, I'd have to look up of any sort of, and again, I think a lot of the research on how effective different things are, it's still so early in the pandemic that there's still a lot of questions out there, but I think anything that you can do to help manage and mitigate the risks and lower the risk by a notch or two or several is going to be good. And I would think a scrubber, you know, it could very well be helpful. And so, you know, I think that could be a piece to it. I think from what I'm hearing, what's important is to not assume that any one thing is going to be a fail safe, right? So just because you have a scrubber doesn't mean that you can start taking off all the other precautions. Just because you wear a mask, it's gonna, all of a sudden eliminate any possibility of transmission. But I think it can be helpful. And so I think, you can, but I can't say specifically how helpful it will be. With what does seem to be the case is just kind of managing risks of COVID transmission. It's a factor of viral load over time, right? As far as the risk for transmission. So if you do some sort of hybrid meeting, keep that in mind. So, the briefer that you can be, that's going to really help mitigate risks. And that's where kind of the pre-work can be really important, getting those reports out ahead of time instead of doing presentations in the meeting. Get all that, so your meeting can be as brief as possible. If you do an in-person meeting, maybe don't do in-person church that day. Again, so you're lowering the amount of time and the amount of people that you're in that space together. So, again, there's nobody has this figured out, but it's about managing risks as best as possible. And trying to eliminate trying to lower the risk, but then also remove any obstacles for participation as far as the annual meeting as well. So yeah, scrubber's good. Yeah.
So should we take a opportunity? Does people want to share ideas that they learned something new that was really helpful in the breakout sessions? Renee?
Can we ask a question? Can we go back
Sure.
to our discussion was, can we do conference call and Zoom at the same time?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So
they work together.
Yeah, I would think so. This is going to be one of those things that you'll have to probably practice and see how it works. This is how I would do it and how I would practice it, is I would have the leader of the conference call be in a quiet room and have their phone on speakerphone and also be on the meeting on Zoom. And so again, their device microphone would pick up the conference call conversation. And again, so constitutionally, the threshold or what you need to make is that simultaneous oral communication, so everybody can hear and be heard. And so the Constitution doesn't care how you get to that. We joked in our meeting, John Savage serves up in Nez Perce, up in the Camas Prairie, where there's a lot of farmers. CB radio, would get simultaneous oral communication as long as everybody's on the same channel. Pass out walkie-talkies. You can, there you go. So again, constitutionally, that would get there. The Constitution doesn't care how you communicate or the technological means of how you get there. It's just that needs to. But I think doing a conference call Zoom combination, you'll want to practice that just to make sure, because what you don't want to have happen is you get to your meeting and you find out, shoot, this isn't working. Well, then you're kind of sunk because you lost. You can't count a number of your people as present.
I'm curious, did anyone in your groups get to the third question? What do you see are some of the advantages of holding your annual meeting online?
This is Jerry. Our group did get to that. Joel and I offered similar advantages, which is we're going to be at this a while. And so the more opportunity we have, particularly for our members that might be on the fringe that aren't quite as comfortable with the technology and so forth, the more experience they have really is to our advantage to be able to effectively communicate with them in the future as well. So while this is, you don't want to be practicing on something as important as an annual meeting, in some cases, that's the only meeting that they will have attended. They're not comfortable coming to church. They're not comfortable with Zoom and so forth. And so we're going to have to think about how we engage them and get them involved to where it's just that kind of first step, getting over that most complicated part. And then hopefully they'll be more comfortable in the future and be able to attend the Bible studies or the services on Sunday or whatever it might be. So this is a incentive to get them to force them to learn how to use it and be comfortable with it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. And to that, think about creative ways to remove barriers. I've talked about leveraging family and like grandparent relationships. And so talk to the kids or grandkids and see if you can't get them to connect with their grandparents over Zoom and just get familiar with the platform. And so leverage that. And then, because I think once people experience Zoom, they figure out, oh, this is pretty easy. And so, you can, think about ways to increase that engagement.
I believe on Thanksgiving Day, Zoom is offering their free account with no time limit. So that might be a way to encourage families to connect and have a little practice with that too. Oh, that's a good point, Mary, with the snowbirds being able to attend a meeting.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. In our group, we talked a little bit about, especially that idea, Cathy, you shared of pre-recording things like the budget and things like you could pre-record reports in a way that could be more interesting than just the written report that's typically included in the annual report or the verbal report at the congregational meeting. And so, think about fun ways to make those reports brief, but also, sharing good information, but also enjoyable. I'm thinking Pastor Dave Haven's probably going to have some report from Celebrations neighborhood.
Hey, that's a good idea, Phil. I hadn't thought of doing that actually, but now that you mention it, might have to be creative.
We could have the ELCA take over TikTok.
Yeah, there you go. All your reports on
presentations.
TikTok. There's a challenge out there for one of you.
Limit 2 minutes. Any other comments, questions today?
One thing I would.
Please feel free.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to lift up that if there are questions unanswered, either from your breakout group or just from listening to this or ongoing, just email them to the staff, to us, any of us, and we'll try to compile them and put that on an e-news and on the website as a resource.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, hey, I just want to reiterate, we're going to do a hybrid council or congregational meeting first part of December, and everybody needs to be seen, but then do they have to be seen the whole meeting, or can they step back away from the Zoom screen?
So seeing is not what's crucial, hearing. So, okay. Yep. So no, you don't need to see everyone. You need to be able to hear everyone and be heard.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean everyone's microphone needs to be unmuted for the whole meeting. They just need to be able to unmute their microphone if they want to talk.
Yeah. And then the other, you talked about the conference call through the Senate. Zoom also has a call-in number. Yep. Also.
Yep.
I'm not sure that we've ever had anybody for all summer long for our services, but that's just another option there also.
Yep, absolutely. And so that's one of the nice features about Zoom is you don't need to have internet to join a meeting if you have the Zoom Pro account, the paid for account. The free account does not include a call-in option. So that's something to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of with the Zoom call-in feature is that those are not local numbers and they're not toll-free numbers. And so if people are calling from a cell phone, that's usually not an issue. But if they're calling from a landline, just know that in our Synod, those are going to be, I think the closest number you can get is a Seattle Tacoma number. And so those calls are going to be long distance. And so just, you know, for a lot of us, that's not an issue, but we have run in, that's something to be clear about if you use the Zoom call-in feature.
Okay, thank you, Phil.
Yep.
Yeah, just reiterate what Phil was saying. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. You know, that might be a key thing for you to keep in mind.
All right. And
So the question from Renee, does Zoom poll work for a written ballot? Well, so here's the deal. It would work as long as nobody challenges it. If you're, it depends on, so if you want to use the Zoom, so maybe for a budget that would be sufficient. I mostly deal, because I deal with call process, with written ballots in the call process. I would not recommend and would say a Zoom poll would not be sufficient for something as important as a call vote. And then there's a couple of other issues with the Zoom poll. Is each device only gets one vote. And so if you have more than one person on a device, you know, you're going to have to count people separately anyways. And so that's right, Elizabeth. It does not allow for multiple votes with a Zoom poll. So that's a real big issue with I do know some Synods have done Synod assemblies, and what they've mandated is that each voting member is on an individual device. And so then they have been able to make use of the things like Zoom polls for some of their votes and also some other voting apps. But again, you know, they've mandated that only one person per device ahead of time. And so that, any, oh, just muted myself. Any other questions?
please feel free to email us as questions come up and let us know if there's resources that you need. We look forward to engaging in whatever way we can to help you out. So all right. So any other questions before we sign off?
I'll stick around for a few minutes too. So if you have questions and you want to stick on, we can continue conversation, but we are right at or just past our 11 a.m. stop time. So those that want to go can go.
Thanks, everybody.
Phil, I just had a clarification about written ballots and having them sent out, because I think I'm trying to establish the best practices.
Yep.
And the anonymity, if you could kind of briefly review that.
Yeah, so it's so what kind of the best practice is to send out with the written ballots, send out an envelope for the ballot to go in. And then the instructions are have, people, whatever ballots are in the envelope, those names are written. And if you want to get really fancy, you can have a print place and then a signature line on the outside of the envelope. And so then as those envelopes are received, what you do is you have the names on the outside. And so as you open the envelopes, you check off, you cross-reference that with your voting member, your attendance list, and say, oh, this person was present at the meeting. And so then if they're present at the meeting and they're a voting member, then you open the envelope, take the ballot that doesn't have a name on it, put it in a bowl. And so you go through all of that process with all of the ballots that come in. And so you make sure that only valid ballots are in that bowl. Then you mix up the bowl and then you count the ballots. And it's a pretty good way to ensure that that it is an anonymous ballot, but you can also verify that only those present are the ones voting and have a record of that. I think in both, I said 3 earlier, but I think I've just been in 2 remote call meetings that were written ballots. In both instances, they did have, because they send out ballots to all of their voting members. They did have people vote. They did have ballots arrived of folks that they did not have documented were at the meeting. So they did have to set those aside and say these are not valid ballots because, we don't have record of their attendance. And for the St. Luke's, they felt a little bit bad for the St. Luke one because with that many people, they could have just missed it. But it was only I think 1 or 2 households. So it was a very, very small percentage. And they could have easily missed that. Those people could have been present, but since they didn't have record of their presence, they couldn't count those votes. You don't have to let people know that their vote didn't counted, but you do need to make sure you only count the votes. And then with the other congregation, they felt bad about that, and so what they did is they had the official count and then they had the unofficial count, so they could. Which both were unanimous, but so they can feel that at least somewhere they tallied their votes, but they couldn't actually report those officially.
My other question is what's the lag time? You were mentioning earlier about having a deadline, and then the lag time, if any. So we have the meeting, for example, on the 3rd Sunday of January. They're calling for written ballots. Those coming through the mail have to arrive by a particular date.
Yeah, I would say postmarked rather than arrived for mail-in ones, just because that sometimes things happen with the mail, but they're postmarked as soon as they're processed through the post office. So that's so if you're going to do mail-in, I would do postmarked by a certain date. And when I was on the legal council with the head of the meeting with the head legal counsel this spring with the ELCA, he suggested 2 weeks would be fine. And so it doesn't need to be real quick. And so a week or 2 is okay, postmarked by a week after the meeting or 2 weeks after the meeting. But just know that, then you can't announce, the results until after that time. The congregations that have wanted to call meeting, there's usually a little bit more impatience around waiting for a vote. So actually Emmanuel Blackfoot did a hybrid meeting. And so they did do mail-in ballots, and they had to wait 2 weeks to announce the result, which actually wasn't an issue because their meeting was 2 weeks ahead of Pocatello's, so it was a joint call. So so they kind of had to wait anyways, so it wasn't a big deal for them. But Pocatello and St. Luke, they didn't want to wait for the mail. And so what they did is they did drop off the next day. And then they also did some work for those members that weren't able to get to the drop-off site. You can assign couriers. So Pocatello had like 40 people on their meeting. And so the meeting was small enough where they just went through one by one and said, Renee, how are you getting your ballot to church? Joel, how are you getting and if they didn't know, then they had a group of volunteers that, said, I'll be happy to swing by your place at, 3 o'clock tomorrow and pick up your ballot. And so some people have wondered, about kind of worried about ballot stuffing and stuff like that on the courier. But, I guess that's a risk, but I think it's a pretty minimal one. Again, if you have it in a signed envelope, you'll just have to, I'm not concerned about that, but that's something to think about. You might not want anybody be the couriers, but they were able to, both of those congregations were able to announce the results the next day. So.
Thanks. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Appreciate this whole meeting and conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
I stayed because I had these ballot questions as well. So that was helpful. And I think our Constitution still has that council members are elected by written ballot.
Oh, sure.
And I think we changed that in the Constitution update that we just are in the middle of, but the Constitution hasn't been approved yet by the congregation. So we're kind of in.
Yep. Yep.
20.
So you'd be subject to that written ballot provision that's in your old Constitution until your next meeting. So yeah, yep. So you'll want to, I think, again, send out ballots ahead of time is the best way to go, and then either drop off or mail in, or you can do a combination of those two things as well.
That was helpful. So I'm good with that. That's
okay.
good. That's a good way to do that. I like the ballot idea. But then what I understood is if they're not on the call or on the call or on the Zoom in the person to vote for at that date, that it won't count. But the good news is they're mostly not contested positions. So, so it should be fine. Okay. Good. This is super helpful.
Yeah, good. Thanks for being here, Renee.
Nice to see you guys.
Yeah, good
nice to see you too.
Be well.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.